Mass evacuation from a Class 10 Deathworld desert. The girl just sat there drinking coffee. The distress signal came in at 3:14 station time, and the first thing I did was check the planet designation twice because I was certain the system had made an error. It had not. Vekarath 4. Class 10 Deathworld. Desert biome. Surface temperature at the poles, which were the coolest parts of the planet, registered at 412 degrees. At the equator, where the mining facility sat, the ground itself was warm enough to melt the landing struts off a standard rescue pod if you left it sitting for longer than 6 minutes. The atmosphere was a soup of nitrogen, sulfur compounds, and fine silicate particulates sharp enough to cut through standard-grade suit material in under an hour of continuous exposure. The electromagnetic fields generated by the planet's iron-rich crust scrambled navigation systems, communication relays, and any unshielded electronic equipment within 200 kilometers of the surface. And underneath that crust lived things that the authorities' xenobiological division had classified, rather unhelpfully, as subsurface megafauna with aggressive territorial behavior and unknown upper size limit. Unknown upper size limit. I had read that line in the mission file 3 times before I understood what it meant. It meant that nobody had ever stayed on the surface long enough to find out how big the creatures got. And somewhere beneath all of that, in a collapsed mining facility 2 kilometers below a salt flat the size of a small continent, 3,200 civilians were sending us a distress signal. I was the senior coordinator on shift. My name is Reese Calloway, and I have worked for the Galactic Rescue Authority for 11 years. I have coordinated extractions from burning stations, from crashing ships, from flooded atmospheric processors on worlds where the rain dissolved organic material on contact. I have sent crews into situations that I would not personally volunteer to enter for any price. I'm not squeamish. I'm not easily rattled. I am, by most professional assessments, very good at my job. I stared at that distress signal for 4 minutes and 17 seconds without moving. Then I opened the crew allocation channel and asked for volunteers. The channel was quiet for a very long time. The first response came from Lieutenant Vale, a senior field operator from the Kathrani delegation, who had 12 years of surface extraction experience across 9 different class environments. His message read, "Coordinator Calloway, with respect, a Class 10 Deathworld desert environment during active storm season falls outside the operational parameters established under Section 14 of the Rescue Authority Field Charter. I recommend we contact the Planetary Mining Consortium for specialist equipment before committing any crew." That was a politely worded way of saying no. The second response, from a 3-person crew out of Base 7, was less politely worded, and I will not repeat it here. The third response was not a response at all, but a formal request for shift reassignment, filed within 90 seconds of the mission briefing going out, from a crew chief who had previously extracted survivors from a Category 8 plasma vent event without flinching. Nobody volunteered. I escalated to command. Command called me back in 4 minutes, which was fast enough to tell me they had already been watching the signal themselves and had already started dreading this conversation. Director Oshin's voice, when it came through, had that particular quality it gets when he is about to tell me something I will not want to hear and has already decided that I do not get a choice in the matter. "We have 1 volunteer," he said. I waited. "She's human," he said, as though this explained something. "I gathered," I said, because I had, even before he told me. No other species had volunteered. The Kathrani were sensible people. The Mavari had a biological aversion to high radiation environments that made Vekarath for a physiological impossibility. The Davhari had strict guild protocols about Class 9 and above environments. The humans, apparently, had a volunteer. "She's not ranked," Oshin said. "She came through the independent contractor registry. Field experience on 3 different class environments, one of which was a Class 8. But she's not a Rescue Authority employee." "What's her name?" I asked. "Ren Barlow," he said. "She's already in the briefing room." I gathered the mission files. I walked to the briefing room. I opened the door. She was sitting in the chair at the far end of the table, the one that faced the door, which most people avoided because it put you directly in the line of sight of whoever walked in. She was not avoiding it. She was sitting in it with the settled, unhurried posture of someone who had arrived early and found a comfortable spot and saw no reason to move. She was young or youngish, mid-30s, maybe, with short dark hair and a calm face that gave nothing away. She was wearing standard contractor field gear, none of it particularly new, all of it clearly used. In her right hand, she held a thermos. The old kind, the kind with a physical seal cap, dented in two places on the side, the paint worn off in a strip where a thumb had rested against it for years. She was drinking from it when I walked in. She did not stop drinking when I sat down. "Wren Barlow," I said. "Yes," she said. She lowered the thermos and looked at me with brown eyes that were entirely calm. I put the mission file on the table and opened it and started talking. I walked her through the surface temperature data, the atmospheric composition readings, the electromagnetic interference projections, the structural status of the collapsed facility, the estimated survival window for unprotected biological material in the surface environment, and the classification profile of the subsurface megafauna. I used the full technical language because she had come through the field registry and I assumed she could follow it, and I watched her face the entire time I spoke. Her face did not change. The three alien liaison officers who had been quietly seated at the side of the table, representatives from the Kathrani, Mavari, and Vethki species whose people were among the trapped civilians, were not handling the briefing as well. The Kathrani representative, a tall, gray-skinned person named Consul Oravath, had gone progressively paler through the atmospheric section and was now sitting very still with both hands flat on the table. The Mavari representative had not said a word since I mentioned the subsurface fauna. The Vethki liaison, a stocky older male named Elder Gale, whose people had built and operated the facility, had been watching Wren with an expression I could not fully read. I finished the briefing. I closed the file. I said, "The authority's probability system estimates a 3% survival rate for any crew that reaches the surface. That figure accounts for the current storm trajectory and the condition of the facility based on structural sensor data. I am required to present that number before any volunteer deployment." I paused. 3%. Wren looked at the file. She reached across the table and turned it toward her. She took the stylus from the edge of the table, circled the number, and wrote 2 words next to it in small, clear letters. Then she turned the file back toward me, picked up her thermos, and drank. I looked at what she had written. It said, "Starting point." Consul Oravath made a small, distressed sound. I looked at Wren. "Do you have any questions about the mission parameters?" "One," she said. "Does anyone on the station have a thermos I can borrow? This one's getting low, and I think it'll be a long day." The Mavari representative stood up, said something in Mavari that my translator rendered as, "I need air," and left the room. Wren watched the door close behind him. Then she looked back at me. There was no humor in her expression, no performance. She was genuinely asking about the thermos. "I'll find you one," I said. "Thank you," she said. "When do we drop?" I looked at her for a long moment. I thought about the 3% figure. I thought about 11 years of coordinating rescues and the particular, specific feeling of knowing a mission was likely to kill the people I sent on it. I had felt that before. I was feeling it now. Wren Barlow was looking at me with calm brown eyes and a dented thermos, and not a trace of the thing that every sensible person in the station was feeling, which was fear. I thought, either she doesn't understand what she's walking into, or she understands it better than I do. I did not know which was true. I would not know for a while. 4 hours, I said. Prep starts now. She nodded, capped her thermos, and stood up. I'll go check my gear. Elder Gale of the Vethki watched her walk out. Then he looked at me. His translator bead rendered his voice in a low, careful tone. Coordinator Calloway, he said, 3,000 of those people down there are Vethki. My people, I need you to tell me that you have more than one plan. I looked at the door Wren had just walked through. I think, I said, that she is the plan. Gale looked at the door for a long moment. Then he looked at the circle number on the mission file. 3%. Starting point. He did not say anything else. He picked up his notes and walked out, and I was left alone in the briefing room with the probability figure and the 2 words she had written next to it. I stared at them for a long time. Then I went to find her thermos. The pod hit the atmosphere of Vekarath 4 at 7:52 and immediately started doing things it was not supposed to do. The electromagnetic interference did not wait politely until we were closer to the surface. It reached up through the outer atmosphere like a hand, grabbed our navigation array, and twisted it. I heard the systems engineer, a quiet young man named Callum, say AV is gone, in the same tone most people use to announce they have run out of coffee. Then he said, shielding compensation at 40% and dropping. And then the pod yawned hard to the left, and nobody said anything for a little while because we were too busy holding on to things. Ren was seated across from me in the pod's main cabin. She had one hand on the overhead grip and one hand holding her thermos. Not the old dented one, but the large insulated one that Station Quartermaster Doyle had found for her, deep silver with a rubberized grip, full to the brim with whatever she had filled it with before boarding. She was not holding the overhead grip particularly hard. She was watching the status board on the cabin wall with an expression of mild professional interest. The pod came out of the worst of the atmospheric shear at approximately 800 meters above the surface and promptly lost another 20% of guidance capability to the field interference. Callum told us we were going to land approximately 19 to 22 kilometers short of the target insertion point. I calculated quickly that this meant we had 19 to 22 kilometers of Vekarath 4 surface between us and the civilian shelter, with 12 hours of suit power in active storm season, and that our communication relay was showing intermittent function at best. Then the pod hit the ground. It hit hard. Not a crash, exactly, but not what anyone would call a landing. We bounced once, skidded across what turned out to be the edge of Salt Flat, and came to rest at a 40-degree angle against a ridge of compressed mineral formation that looked, in the pale light coming through the viewport, like the spine of something enormous. I ran the damage assessment. The pod's guidance array was gone. The primary comms relay was functional at 60%, and one of the landing strut assemblies had sheared clean off. The pod was not going anywhere on its own. It was, however, mostly intact and providing us with shade, which on Vekarath 4 was not a trivial thing. Our team was Rin, myself, Callum, the systems engineer, and 4 alien crew members who had volunteered from their respective species rescue teams because their people were in that facility. There was Yael, a young Kathrani woman who was the best structural analyst the Authority had on the station. There was Ori, a broad-shouldered Mavari medic who had not said much since the briefing, but moved with the efficiency of someone who had been in hard situations before. And there were 2 Vethki crew, a pair of brothers named Solon and Davin, who knew the facility layout better than anyone because their father had helped build it. We climbed out of the pod into Vekarath 4. The heat hit like a wall. Not like warmth, not like standing near a fire, but like the air itself was pushing on me from all sides with actual physical weight. My suit's thermal management system kicked into high gear immediately, and I heard it working. The light was extraordinary. The sun of Vekarath 4 was close and huge, and the sky was not blue but a washed-out white gold that hurt to look at even through the visor. The salt flat around us was blinding. It was featureless in every direction except for the mineral ridge behind us, and at the far western edge of where I could see the first suggestion of the storm system that was crawling toward us across the flatlands. I stood there and did the math, and the math was not encouraging. 19 kilometers minimum. 12 hours of suit power. Storm coming from the west. Communication relay at 60% and dropping. The surface temperature outside my suit was reading 438 degrees, and the silicate particulates in the air were already producing a faint hiss against my helmet that meant they were working on it. Rin climbed out of the pod behind me, looked around once, and sat down on a fragment of the sheared landing strut. She opened her thermos and drank. I turned to look at her. I could not help it. We were on the surface of a Class 10 Deathworld in active storm season with broken equipment, and the only way out was through 19 kilometers of open terrain, and she sat down and drank from her thermos like she was in a station cafeteria waiting for a shift briefing. "What are you doing?" I said. Thinking, she said. "Can you think while moving?" "Not this particular thought," she said. She took another sip. The rest of the crew was standing in a loose cluster near the pod, watching her. The two Vethke brothers were whispering to each other in their language, and my translator wasn't close enough to catch it. Callum was running damage assessments on his wrist unit. Yael was scanning the terrain. Ori was checking the med kit. Ren put the thermos away. She stood up and walked to the wreckage of the pod's nose section, which had crumpled on impact and was now lying in a rough heap about 10 meters from the main body. She crouched and started sorting through it with her hands, pulling pieces out and setting them in two piles. Nobody had asked her to do this. After about 30 seconds, she said, "Callum." Callum looked up. "Yes." "The power cells in the nose compartment. How many survived the impact?" Callum came over and checked. 3 full cells and 1 partial. "Good. I need those, and the main communications relay housing, and whatever length of the thermal insulation strip you can pull from the door panel. And if anyone has a standard multi-tool, get it out now." Callum looked at me. I nodded. He started pulling components. What happened over the next 40 minutes was the kind of thing I could describe but probably cannot fully convey. Rin worked with the components from the crash pod the way a person works with something they have done before many times in slightly different forms. She was not rushing. She was not performing. She moved from one task to the next with a logic I could follow once I saw where she was going, and the destination she was building toward was a portable heat shield array that she had wired from 3 power cells, a section of the pod's own hull plating, and a thermal strip from the door panel, mounted on a frame she made from the structural supports of the cargo net. It would not last forever. She was clear about that. She said it would give us perhaps 7 hours of reduced thermal exposure in the surrounding area, enough to extend our suit life significantly if we stayed close to it. It would also block some of the silicate particulate if angled correctly. Then she built a signal relay extension from the pod's main comms housing and a length of antenna wire she had stripped from the interior, which would boost our 60% relay to something closer to 80 and extend our contact range with the ships above. I watched her do all of this. The rest of the crew helped when she asked them to, and she asked in a way that assumed they were competent and would follow quickly. And they were, and they did. We were 20 minutes into the construction when the ground moved. Not an earthquake, not a tremor. The salt flat, which had looked completely solid, simply flexed downward in a section about 30 meters to our left, and then came back up, and the crack that formed along the edge of the flex section ran toward us at a speed that I could actually see. Solon shouted. Davin was already moving, grabbing his brother's arm and pulling him back. The crack reached the edge of where Callum was standing, and the ground under Callum's right foot dropped 6 centimeters in half a second. Ren was across the distance before I had finished processing what was happening. She had Callum's arm and Ori's arm, and she was pulling both of them back from the cracking section with a force that I would not have expected from her frame, and all 3 of them stumbled back together onto the solid section of the flat, just as the ground where Callum had been standing dropped a full meter and exposed a cavity beneath. Something moved in the cavity. Large. I cannot see it clearly, but I could see the shadow of it, and the shadow was the size of a cargo loader. Ren released Callum and Ori and looked at her right hand. Her glove was gone. It had caught on a piece of fractured salt crystal on the flat and torn away when she was pulling Callum clear. She looked at her bare hand for 2 seconds. Then she reached into her kit, took out the emergency sealant foam, applied it to her hand in a single even pass, and went back to wiring the communications relay. "The construction is almost done," she said, as though none of that had just happened. "Ren," I said. "I know," she said, "but we have about 11 hours left and 19 kilometers to walk, and I'd like to finish this while we have shade from the pod. Help me hold this section of housing while I seal it." I held the housing. She sealed it. Callum ran a function check, and the relay lit up, and our signal strength to the ships above jumped to 79%, which was better than she had promised. She packed the heat shield array onto the frame, distributed the weight among the team, and checked each person's suit systems once. Not asking if we were ready. Checking. There's a difference, and I felt it. Then she slung her kit on her back, picked up her thermos, and started walking toward the white. 19 kilometers, she said, without turning around. The storm hits from the west in approximately 9 hours based on the last trajectory data. We should have about an hour of clearance before the front reaches the facility coordinates. Let's not waste it. We followed her. I watched her walk, and I thought about what had just happened, and I tried to understand it. She had planned, built, repaired, and moved, all without a single moment of the thing the rest of us had been feeling since the pod hit the ground. I thought, at first, that it was the kind of calm that comes from not fully grasping the situation. But she had read the same briefing files I had. She had heard the same numbers. She knew exactly what this place was. I decided, somewhere in the first kilometer of walking, that she was not calm because she was unaware. She was calm because she had looked at every terrible thing on this planet and quietly assigned each one of them a category. And the category was problem I've already started solving. She handed me her thermos when we were 3 kilometers out. Drink something, she said. You look pale. I drank. It was coffee. Strong, black, and slightly too hot for someone who was already standing in a 400-degree environment. It was the best thing I had tasted in years. I handed it back. She walked on, into the white, and we followed. The mining facility's emergency access shaft was exactly where the structural charts said it would be, which was the first piece of good news we had received since the pod hit the ground. It was a vertical drop of 18 meters through a reinforced alloy tube, sealed at the top by an emergency hatch that Davin opened with his palm print, because his personnel file was still in the facility's access registry. The hatch opened. We dropped down one at a time on the emergency ladder, and when I reached the bottom and stepped off the ladder and stood in the first pressurized corridor of the facility, I understood very quickly that the situation inside was considerably worse than the sensor data had suggested. The corridor was hot, not Vekarath force surface hot. Nothing inside a pressurized structure could be that hot and still contain living people, but hot enough that my suit's thermal readings were flashing amber warnings, which meant the interior temperature was somewhere between 60 and 80 degrees and rising. The structural walls, which should have been a uniform pale gray, were buckled in 3 places that I could see from where I was standing, and one section near the ceiling had a crack running along it that was not structural damage. It was a heat crack, the kind that forms when material is being cooked from the outside. The corridor was also full of people. Not all 3,200 of them. This was one of the assembly corridors, a mid-level passageway that connected several of the facility's work sections, and it held maybe 200 people pressed together in the available space, most of them sitting against the walls, many of them in various states of physical distress. I could see at least 5 different species in the corridor, Vethki in their pale blue atmosphere suits, Kathrani with their gray skin gone darker with heat stress, Mavari with their secondary respiratory membranes visible and working hard, 3 or 4 species I recognized but could not immediately name, and 2 humans, a man and a woman, both of whom looked up when we came off the ladder with the kind of expression that meant they had been waiting a very long time for someone to come off. That ladder. Ren was the last one down. She stepped off the bottom rung, took one complete look up and down the corridor, a single slow sweep that I recognized by now as her version of a full assessment, an uncapped her thermos. She drank. Nobody spoke for a moment. The 200 people in the corridor were watching her. She lowered the thermos. Who's coordinating? She said, to the corridor in general. One of the humans stood up. His name, as I would later learn, was Pierce. He was a mid-level shift supervisor, a large man in his 40s with a burn along one side of his neck that he had sealed with the same emergency foam I had used on Ren's hand. He had the look of a person who had been keeping other people from falling apart through sheer effort of will for approximately 20 hours and was beginning to feel the cost of it. I am, he said. Pierce, shift supervisor, level 3 operations. Good, Ren said. She walked toward him, and they spoke quietly for 4 minutes while I stood and watched and got my bearings. Ori moved into the crowd with a med kit without being asked. Yal pulled out her structural scanner and started working it along the wall cracks. Solon and Davin split apart and moved down the corridor in opposite directions, checking faces, looking for people they knew. What Ren and Pierce were doing was not a conversation, exactly. It was a data transfer. She asked questions, and he answered them, and she filed each answer somewhere and moved to the next question. I could not hear most of it, but I caught fragments. Facility layout. Which sections were sealed, which were compromised. Current count of survivors. Which species were in the worst shape and where they were concentrated. Power status. Air recycler status. Food and water reserves. When they were done, Rin nodded at Pierce once. Then she turned to me. 3,041 survivors confirmed, she said. 159 are unaccounted for, but the search teams inside think most of them are in the lower maintenance sections where the comms are out. The structural situation is manageable in the upper 3 levels, but the 4th and 5th levels have significant heat breach. There are 400 Mavari in the 4th level because it was the coolest section 2 days ago. It is not the coolest section anymore. They need to move now. She paused. The air recyclers on the main network are at 60% capacity. They have been reducing the atmospheric mix to stretch the reserves, which means that anything with higher oxygen requirements is already in mild respiratory distress. That includes all the Kathrani and the humans. What about the Vethki? I said. The Vethki are more heat tolerant than most of the species here, which is helping them stay functional, but Elder Gale's family is down there, and he asked me through the relay before we dropped to look for a man named Harvin. That's Solon and Davin's problem right now. She looked at the corridor. We need to move the Mavari first, then establish a consolidated staging area in the upper access corridor closer to the emergency shaft, so we can sequence the evacuation when the ships come down. She said it as though the ships were definitely going to come down. Not as though she hoped they would, or was working toward the possibility. As though it was simply a logistical event on a timeline she had already mapped. The extraction window is the issue, I said. The storm front gives us approximately 1 hour before the surface conditions become impassable for the rescue ships. We need to get 3,000 people to the surface egress point in that window. I know, she said. That's going to be... I know, she said. She was not dismissing me. She was telling me she had already calculated it and was already working on what to do about it. I shut up and let her work. What followed was 4 hours of the most concentrated organizational effort I have ever witnessed. Rin moved through the facility the way current moves through a circuit, not stopping anywhere for longer than was necessary, appearing in sections where problems were developing before anyone had sent word about those problems, making decisions that I would have needed 20 minutes to consult on, and she was making in 30 seconds and moving on. She sent Ori and Yael to the 4th level with 2 of the Mavari's own community leaders to organize the migration upward. She put Callum on the comms relay, maintaining our signal to the ships above and coordinating a real-time update on survivor status. She set Pierce up as the ground coordinator for the staging area, giving him a clear list of priorities and the authority to make calls in her absence. She assigned Davin and Solon to the lower maintenance section to find the missing 159. They found 142 of them. The remaining 17, they learned from the survivors they found, had been in the section that had experienced the deepest structural collapse 3 days earlier. Ren heard this from Solon, nodded once, said, "We note them in the record," and kept moving. There was a moment, about 2 hours in, when it almost stopped. Elder Vel was the head of the Vethki Mining Consortium. He was old, powerfully built even in physical distress, and he had spent his life in positions of authority. When Ren walked into the Central Operations Hub and started directing the Vethki facility workers to reinforce the 3rd-level corridor walls with mining equipment, Vel stood up and said, in a voice that expected to be obeyed, "Who authorized this human to give orders in my facility?" The room went very quiet. Ren stopped. She turned and looked at Vel with an expression that was not angry and not dismissive, and was, in fact, one of the most level expressions I have ever seen on a human face. "Look behind you," she said. Vel did not look behind himself. He said, "This facility belongs to the Vethki Mining Consortium, and..." "Look behind you," she said again. Something in her voice made him stop. He turned slowly. The wall directly behind him had a crack running through it. Not a large crack. A new crack, formed in the last few minutes from the heat differential working on the section. At the widest point, it was perhaps 2 centimeters, but it was spreading slowly with the grain of the material. Vel looked at the crack for a long time. The corridor on the other side of that wall leads to the section where 600 of your people are currently waiting for evacuation, Ren said. I need the mining equipment in this hub to shore up the support columns on both sides of it. I need it in the next 20 minutes. After that, you can discuss authorization with whoever you like, but I need it now. Vel looked at the crack. He looked at Ren. Then he turned to his facility workers and said, in Vethki, something that my translator rendered as, do what she says. All of it. Ren was already moving to the next problem. I followed her through the facility and I watched her work, and I thought about what was keeping everything from coming apart. It was not the wall she was shoring up. It was not the equipment she was redirecting. It was her. Her presence in a room changed the temperature of it in a way that had nothing to do with Vekarath 4 surface. People saw her moving with that particular certainty, and they steadied. They stopped spending energy on fear and started spending it on the task she put in front of them. I understood, somewhere in that second hour, that this was not a skill she had been taught. It was a thing that had been built into her by a life that had required it. The place she came from had made this of her, the same way the planet above us made the razor-edged silicate dust, just a natural product of the environment. Late in the 4th hour, when the staging area was established and the population was organized into evacuation groups, and Callum had boosted the relay to 82%, and the ships above were receiving clean coordinates, Ren found a quiet corner of the upper access corridor, sat down against the wall, refilled her thermos from a civilian's emergency ration pack of hot liquid, and drank. A Kathrani child who had been sitting nearby with her family watched Ren drink for a long moment. Then, in the direct way that Kathrani children apparently have, said, "Are you not afraid?" Ren looked at the child. She thought about it, which I appreciated. She did not give a fast answer. "No," she said. "Why not?" the child asked. Ren was quiet for a moment. "I grew up in a place where being afraid didn't help," she said. "So I learned to use the time for something else." The Kathrani child looked at her with wide eyes and said nothing. Ren drank her coffee. I asked her, quietly, from where I was sitting nearby, "Were you ever afraid?" "Even once today." She looked at me over the rim of her thermos. The look was the same one she had given the 3% figure in the briefing room, the one that could not quite believe the question was being asked. Then she lowered the thermos and said, "Ask me after we get everyone out." I thought that was not a no. The storm arrived 11 minutes earlier than the updated trajectory data had predicted. This is the thing about Vekarath 4 that no model fully captures. The thing that the authorities' probability systems can account for statistically, but cannot make you feel until you are standing underneath it. The storms on this planet do not approach. They do not build gradually on the horizon and give you the professional courtesy of a visible warning. They move across the salt flats at speeds that are difficult to process as a fixed point on the ground. And by the time you can see a Category 9 electromagnetic storm front on Vekarath 4 as a distinct object in your visual field, you have approximately 4 minutes before its leading edge is on top of you. The leading edge of this one appeared on the western horizon at 1741 as a wall of pale light that looked, at first, like a second dawn coming from the wrong direction. By 1743, it had grown to fill the western third of the sky, and the sound it made was a low, continuous frequency that I felt in my chest before I heard it with my ears. Callum said, "Storm front early, 11 minutes, comms holding at 78%, in the same tone he had been maintaining all day, which was low and even and contained no unnecessary information. Ren said, "Begin sequence now," and the evacuation, which we had been staging for the last 2 hours, shifted from preparation to execution. Here is what 3,041 people evacuating through a single surface egress point looks like in practice. It looks like controlled chaos moving in one direction. We had organized them into groups by species, physical mobility, and thermal tolerance, and each group had a lead coordinator from their own community who had been briefed on the sequence and the timing. The egress point was the emergency access shaft we had come down, plus 3 additional shafts that Solon and Davin had identified in the facility records and opened in the hours we had spent inside. 4 shafts for simultaneous lines of ascent. The first groups went up smoothly. The Kathrani moved well, the Vethki moved well, The groups with mobility limitations have been given priority and were already most of the way to the surface by the time the storm front's leading electromagnetic pulse reached the outer edge of the salt flat. The first pulse hit the surface electronics 3 kilometers out, and every active system on our wrist units flickered simultaneously. Ren was at the base of shaft 2, counting people through, and she did not look up. "Callum," she said. "Relay held," Callum said from the top of shaft 1, where he had been stationed since we began. "Lost 3 seconds of signal. Ships are holding position. Good. Keep counting." I was at the base of shaft 3. I was watching the steady flow of people going up, and I was also watching my suit's environmental readings because the heat inside the facility was climbing again now that the storm was close enough to be affecting the surface temperature differentials. The Mavari were the slowest moving group, and they were only 2/3 of the way through their count. Then the second pulse hit. It was larger than the first. I knew this because the lights in the facility did not just flicker. They went out. For 4 seconds, we were in complete darkness 3 kilometers underground on a Class 10 Deathworld with 3,000 people in the middle of an evacuation. I heard the intake of breath from the people around me in the dark. I heard a child somewhere begin to cry. I heard the particular sound of several hundred people trying very hard not to panic. Then the emergency lighting came on, red and dim, and Ren's voice came through the comms, steady and immediate. "Keep moving. The shaft lights are on independent power," and they held. "Look up, you'll see light above you. Move toward it. Keep moving." They kept moving. The third pulse, when it came 8 minutes later, was the one that caused the collapse. It did not collapse the shaft we were using. It collapsed a section of the tunnel system on the 4th level, the section that had been structurally compromised by the heat breach and that the mining equipment had been reinforcing for the past 4 hours. The reinforcement had been doing its job, but the electromagnetic pulse produced a localized surge in the conducting metal structures of the facility, and the surge was more than the compromised section could absorb. I heard it as a long, deep groan from below, and then a sharper sound, and then a cascade of sounds that meant things were falling in a sequence. The section that collapsed was not occupied. We had moved everyone out of it 6 hours ago. But the collapse rerouted the structural stress through the tunnel system in a way that put new pressure on the outer wall of the lower access corridor, the corridor where the last group, 104 Mavari who had been the furthest from the egress shafts and the slowest moving, were currently walking. I heard Yael's scanner alarm from 40 meters away before she said the word. "Callaway, the lower access wall is failing. Southeast section. I have maybe 4 minutes." I was already running. Ren was faster. I do not know how she knew before Yael's scanner went off. I do not know what signal she read, whether it was the sound or the feeling through the floor, or simply a calculation she had been running continuously about structural failure probabilities. But she was already moving down the lower access corridor when I turned the corner, moving against the flow of the Mavari who were heading toward the shaft, moving back into the section that was failing. "Ren," I called. "Keep them moving," she said without turning. I kept them moving. I counted them through one by one, the 104 Mavari and Ori, the medic who had been the last person walking with them. And I watched the southeast wall, and I watched the cracks working across it, and I counted. 97, 98, 99. The wall groaned. The crack widened. 100, 101. Ori came through at 102. He looked back at the corridor behind him and then at me and said, "There are 2 more." 103 came through a run, a young Mavari woman who had stumbled and been helped back up. She was carrying a child on her back. That was 104. I said into comms, "That's 4. All clear from lower access. Seal the blast door." Ren's voice came through. "There's 1 more," she said. "I have her." The blast door controls were in my hand. The wall behind Ren was failing. The storm above was sending its 4th pulse, and I could feel it coming in my suit's warning system, a low vibration that meant the next one was larger than any of the ones before it. I waited. They came through the gap in the wall section. Not the door, the gap, because the door had already partially jammed from structural stress, and the gap was not large, but Rin came through it sideways, and she had a Vethki elder over her shoulder, and both of them came through into the corridor, and I hit the blast door control, and the door sealed behind them. The wall on the other side came down 11 seconds later. I know because I counted. Ren set the Vethki elder down. The elder was elderly, not Vel, a small woman, one of the facility residents who had been sheltering in a side room that the initial evacuation count had missed. She was shaken but intact. Ren straightened up. She had salt crystal burns along the right side of her neck, where the gap in the wall section had scraped her suit against the mineral face. Her thermal readings were in the amber again. She looked at her right arm, the one with the sealed hand from the surface, and moved the fingers experimentally. Then she looked at me. "Shaft 1, she said. "They're waiting." We ran. The final stretch of the evacuation was 312 people going up 4 shafts simultaneously, while the storm's leading edge covered the sky above us, and the rescue ships held in position at the edge of the electromagnetic envelope, waiting for a clear window. Callum maintained the relay through 2 more pulse events by physically bracing the antenna housing with his own body against the edge of the egress point, which was not in any field manual but worked. The last group emerged onto the surface at 1824. The storm wall was close enough now that the light had changed color, a deep amber wash across the entire sky that made the salt flat look like it was on fire. The rescue ships began their descent the moment Callum confirmed the final count. They were loud coming down. The size of them, the sound of their engines working against the interference, the way the heat displacement from their drives hit the salt flat and sent up clouds of mineral dust. It was the best thing I'd ever seen. Ren sat down on the salt flat. She sat cross-legged in the open, outside, on the surface of a Class 10 Deathworld during an active Category 9 electromagnetic storm, and she took out her thermos and drank what was left in it and watched the ships come down. I sat next to her. I did not know what else to do. Her name was Ovelyn, she said, of the Vethki elder she had carried out. "I know," I said. "She'd been in that room for 3 days," she said. She thought everyone had forgotten she was there. I had nothing to say to that. The first ship touched down 300 meters to our east. The doors opened. The process of boarding began, and it was orderly, and it was fast, and the rescue crews who came off the ships were excellent and professional, and they knew exactly what to do. Ren watched it all. She finished her coffee. The amber light of the storm turned everything the color of old metal. The wind from the approaching front moved across the flat and picked up the top layer of silicate dust and carried it east in a long, low wave. She looked at me and said, "Does anyone on the ships have more coffee?" I laughed. I could not help it. It came out of me before I could decide whether it was appropriate, a genuine full laugh that I had not expected, and then I was also doing something with my eyes that I was not expecting, and I looked away at the horizon for a moment until I had control of both. "I'll find you some," I said. She nodded. She stood up. She slung her kit on her back and walked toward the boarding ramp of the nearest ship. 3,041 people were boarding around her. She was not the first up the ramp. She was not making a speech. She walked in the same way she had walked from the moment I met her, with that unhurried certainty like the ground under her feet was something she had already made arrangements with. She was the last one up the ramp. The debrief took 9 days. 9 days of testimony, cross-examination, structural analysis, medical reports, probability modeling, and formal presentations from 12 different species consulate representatives, all assembled in the authority's Joint Inquiry Chamber on Station Orvith. 12, the largest neutral governance facility in that region of space. The chamber was built to hold 200 people comfortably. On the 5th day of testimony, it held 340, and they had to open the overflow observation bays to accommodate the rest of the people who wanted to watch. I gave my testimony on the 3rd day. I spoke for 6 hours. I was asked the same questions in different forms by 9 different representatives, and I answered all of them as accurately as I could. I described the crash, the surface crossing, the construction of the heat shield array, the descent into the facility, the evacuation sequencing, the final extraction of the Vethki Elder. I described Ren's decision-making process as I had observed it, step by step, as precisely as my memory allowed. When I finished, Consul Oravath of the Kathrani delegation asked me a single question. "In your professional assessment, Coordinator Calloway, What would the survival outcome have been for the civilian population of that facility without the involvement of Wren Barlow specifically? I thought about the answer for a long moment, not because I did not know it, but because I wanted to be accurate rather than dramatic. 0, I said. The chamber was quiet. The probability engine gave us 3%, I said. That 3% assumed a functional landing with intact equipment and a clear surface approach. We did not have any of those things. Without the equipment she built from the crash wreckage, we would not have reached the facility. Without the evacuation sequencing she designed, we would not have cleared the corridors before the structural failures cascaded. Without her personally returning to the lower access corridor, we would have lost the final group in O'Vellon. I paused. The number wasn't 3%. With what we actually had when we landed, the number was 0. She changed the number. Consul Oravath wrote something in the official record. Then she looked at me with an expression that I had seen on Kathrani faces before, the one that meant they were processing something that had not fit into any existing category they had available. "Thank you, Coordinator," she said. Wren testified on the 7th day. She arrived with a fresh thermos. Not the dented one from before, but not the large silver one either. A new one, same style as the old, that someone had clearly gotten for her in the interim. She sat at the witness table in front of the 12-member panel, and she held the thermos, and she answered every question put to her with the same economy she applied to everything else. One answer per question. No elaboration unless asked. The precision of someone who does not use more words than the situation requires. They asked her to account for the decision to construct the heat shield array from crash wreckage. She described the decision process in 4 sentences. They asked her to account for the evacuation sequencing methodology. She described it in 7 sentences. They asked her to account for the return to the lower access corridor in the final minutes of the evacuation. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "O'Vellon was there. The count was wrong, and she was there." One of the panel members, a Mavari delegate named Senior Arbiter Morvac, said, "The structural risk at that point was significant. Your suit readings indicated thermal exposure well above recommended limits. You had already sustained physical injuries. What made you determine that the return was the correct decision?" Wren looked at him. "She was there," she said. Morvac looked at her for a long time. Then he wrote something in the record and moved on. Elder Vell of the Vethki Mining Consortium testified on the 6th day. I watched from the observation bay. I expected him to give a careful, diplomatic account of the events inside the facility, the kind of testimony that large institutional entities give when they're trying to manage how the record reflects on them. He did not. He stood before the panel, and he said that Wren Barlow had moved through his people's station the way a river moves. He said this with no apparent awareness that it was one of the most profound things anyone had said in that chamber in the 9 days of hearings. He said it the way you say a thing that is simply true. Then he said that his people have been building facilities on hard worlds for 300 years, and they were not, as a people, easily impressed by capability. Then he said that he had been impressed. For a Vethki elder of his generation and standing, I was told later by Solon, this was the rough equivalent of dropping to his knees. Elder O'Vellon testified by recorded message on the 8th day, because her physical recovery was still ongoing and travel was not advisable. She was 73 years old and had survived 3 days alone in a closing room on a Class 10 Deathworld. Her message was 2 minutes long. For the first 90 seconds, she described the evacuation in the same careful, procedural detail that her age and cultural background required. Then, in the last 30 seconds, she said, "The human girl came back for me." I want that written in the record clearly, not as a note, as the main thing. The chair of the panel noted it in the record as the main thing. On the 9th day, the panel called Wren for a follow-up session. They had 3 questions. The first was whether she would accept a formal commendation from the authority. She said yes. The second was whether she would accept appointment to a senior field command position within the rescue authority, with full credentials, salary, and equipment allocation. She said yes, with one condition, which she stated clearly, that she be permitted to requisition a proper insulated thermos for every mission she led, for every member of her team, because she had found in her experience that staying hydrated in high-stress environments was operationally significant, and she wanted it treated as standard equipment rather than a personal item. The panel discussed this for 4 minutes and approved it. I suspect they would have approved almost anything she asked for at that point. The third question was the one I had been waiting for, the one that I had heard in every informal conversation in the corridors and observation bays throughout the 9 days of hearings, the one that every species representatives had been circling from a distance without quite managing to ask directly. It was Morvac who finally asked it. He leaned forward and said, "Mess, Barlow, I want to ask you something outside the formal record of decisions and technical analysis. You volunteered for this mission when every other qualified field operator in the Authority declined. You were presented with a planetary environment that the Authority's own models assessed as essentially unsurvivable for any extraction crew. You walked into that environment with equipment designed for far less extreme conditions, and you performed an extraction that our probability systems had rated at effectively 0 chance of success." He paused. "I have been sitting on this panel for 9 days, trying to understand why you were not afraid. I would like to ask you directly." The chamber was very quiet. Rin looked at him. She held her thermos in both hands. She took a breath. "I grew up in the northern high desert region of a continent called Australia," she said. "On Earth," she paused. "If you have the time, I can explain what that means." The panel had the time. She described it in the way she described everything. Simply, without drama, without any apparent sense that what she was describing was unusual. She described a landscape where the summer temperature routinely exceeded 50 degrees, where the ground was hard and red and indifferent, where drought was not an emergency, but a season, where the fauna— and here she paused for a breath, and I thought I caught the ghost of something that might have been amusement— where the fauna included things that could kill you in dozens of different ways if you were not paying attention. She described learning to read the land before she could read a book, learning which color of sky meant which kind of weather, learning how to find water in a place that did not want to give it to you, learning that the ground could move and the air could turn against you, and the things living alongside you were not always friendly, and that none of this was a disaster. It was just the conditions. Earth tried to kill us for a very long time, she said. We got better at it. We learned what it was teaching us. She looked at Morvac and then at the rest of the panel. Vekarath 4 was hard. It was not unfamiliar. The chamber was silent for a long time. Then Morvac said quietly, "Earth is classified as a Class 5 Deathworld." "Yes," she said. "And you landed on a Class 10, he said. She looked at him. "I noticed," she said. Somewhere behind me in the observation bay, a Kathrani person laughed. It was a short sound, quickly muffled, but it rippled outward, and in 30 seconds the observation bay was doing a thing that I had not expected a formal inquiry observation bay to do, which was laugh. Rin did not laugh, but something moved at the corner of her mouth that had not been there before. I wrote the final incident report that evening. I had been putting it off for 3 days. It was not a long document in the end. The record of decisions and events was all contained in the testimony, but the final assessment section required a narrative conclusion, and the narrative conclusion required me to find words for something I had been observing for 9 days. I tried several versions. I tried describing the mission in terms of survival statistics. I tried describing it in terms of the specific technical decisions that had made the difference. I tried describing Rin's contribution in the language of field assessment, leadership qualities, environmental competency. None of it was wrong. None of it was complete. I spent 3 hours on the conclusion, and in the end I wrote 4 sentences. The Galactic Rescue Authority's first successful, full extraction from a Class 10 Deathworld environment was achieved through the field leadership of one human operator, Rin Barlow, in conditions that the Authority's own models assessed as offering 0 probability of mission success. The record of her decisions during the 41-hour operational period is available in full in the testimony archive. For context on the broader question of how such a result was possible, I refer the reader to the origin coordinates of the field operator in question, which are on file. Earth explains most of it. I sent it to the panel chair that night. The next morning, Rin was already gone. She had been deployed the previous evening to a Class 9 somewhere in the Outer Rim. I found this out when I went to find her for a conversation that I had been forming for 9 days and found her bay empty and her gear gone and only the large silver thermos from the first mission sitting on the shelf, which she had clearly decided was a station asset rather than a personal one. I picked it up. It was still warm. I thought about what she had said to me on the salt flat when I asked if she was afraid, and she had said, "Ask me after we get everyone out." I had never gotten around to asking her again. I thought now that the answer had been in the thermos she left behind, in the simple fact that she had taken a new one and moved on without ceremony and without looking back. She was on another Class 9 somewhere out there in the dark, with her new thermos and her kit, and that particular expression of calm that I would spend the rest of my career trying to accurately describe and failing, because there is not a word in any language in the authorities database that covers the specific quality of a creature that has grown up on a world that tried to end it and decided, instead of becoming afraid, to become very good at not dying. The closest I ever found was the word Earth itself, offered without further explanation, as a complete answer to the question of what she was and where she came from and why, on a planet where every surface condition conspired to make survival impossible. She had sat down in the middle of it and drank her coffee and solved the problem. That word covered all of it. I kept the thermos.